Reasons small aircraft carriers don't make much sense. The U.S. Navy is building a new class of large-deck, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that eventually will replace all 10 of the Nimitz-class carriers in the current fleet. Called the Ford class, the lead ship is named after President Gerald R. Ford. The new carriers will host more aircraft and generate a third more sorties per day while requiring less manpower and greatly boosting onboard generation of electricity. Virtually every feature of the new carriers, from their flight decks to their nuclear reactors, has been redesigned. This transformation is overdue. Development of the existing carrier fleet began during the 1960s, when manpower was cheap and the information revolution still lay decades in the future. Each successive ship in the Nimitz class was upgraded as new technology became available, but if you want a truly modern ship, then you need to start over, and that's what the Navy has done. Construction of the USS Gerald R. Ford began in 2008 and the ship has now been commissioned. Construction of a second Ford-class carrier commenced in 2013. The Navy estimates that second carrier will cost $11.4 billion to build, which as chance would have it is almost exactly the amount of money the federal government spends each day. With only one carrier scheduled to be built every 5 years, the cost of modernizing the carrier fleet is little more than a rounding error in federal budget deliberations. Nonetheless, a handful of critics, mostly outside the Navy, is trying to rekindle an old debate about whether it would make more sense to buy smaller carriers that cost less money to build and operate. There are several ideas floating around about what a small carrier might look like. For example, Captain Pete Pagano, USN retired, proposed in an August 29 essay published by the Center for International Maritime Security that the Navy build a new class of sea control ships based on amphibious assault vessels used to lift Marine Expeditionary Units. These would in effect be small aircraft carriers hosting vertical takeoff jump shays and various rotorcraft that could take over some of the missions currently assigned to Nimitz and Ford carriers. Carriers displacing 45,000 tons of water, such as Pagano proposes, would be similar in size to France's Charles de Gaulle or the legacy USS Midway. They would host far fewer aircraft than the large deck carriers, which have over 4 acres of deck space and displace 100,000 tons. Pagano says his sea control ship would complement the large deck carriers, but in a fiscally constrained world where federal deficits are headed back to $1 trillion annually, they would probably end up being substituted instead. The Navy has been having big versus small debates about the composition of the carrier fleet since World War II, and if we go through another such round, the large decks will prevail once again on the merits. So before Congress spends a lot of time and money relearning what most naval experts already know, let's briefly list the most obvious reasons why buying smaller carriers simply doesn't make much sense. Small carriers have less speed and endurance. The newest America class of amphibs has a top speed of about 23 miles per hour. The Ford class has a top speed of 35 miles per hour, 50% higher thanks to nuclear propulsion. Nuclear propulsion also gives large deck carriers unlimited range and endurance at sea. So a Nimitz or Ford can exert U.S. influence over a far bigger expanse of land or sea than a small carrier powered by fossil fuel, and for a much longer period of time. Small carriers are harder to sustain. Conventionally powered small aircraft carriers would require frequent replenishment of their fuel by tankers. That entails establishing a costly global logistics system and refueling schedule that in wartime might send the tankers into harm's way or require the carriers to withdraw to safer locales. The tankers, their crews, and the fuel they deliver would cost many billions of dollars over the lifetime of a small carrier fleet. Small carriers are less productive. Small carriers typically generate only half the daily aircraft sorties of large carriers. First, they carry fewer planes. Second, their flight decks are too crowded to sustain high-intensity operations. Third, they are less stable in heavy seas, precluding flight operations on particularly rough days. When you factor in all the constraints of operating small carriers, the loss of warfighting punch is greater than the difference in size might imply, and grossly disproportionate to the modest savings in money. Small carriers are less safe. Operating multiple aircraft types from carriers with limited space on their flight decks is more dangerous than operating from the spacious expanses of a large deck carrier. Smaller deck carriers appear to have nearly double the aircraft accident rate of large deck carriers. Furthermore, when an accident does occur, there is far less space for working around any obstructions in order to continue air operations. Small carriers are less survivable. A large deck carrier such as the Nimitz or Ford has hundreds of watertight compartments that limit the effects of damage below the waterline. The high speed of constantly moving nuclear-powered carriers enables them to outrun hostile submarines while complicating the challenge of targeting them from overhead. Large deck carriers have more defensive systems, sensors and weapons than smaller carriers, and much more space to absorb damage without being fully disabled. Small carriers have less storage space and growth margin. A Ford-class carrier has over twice the storage space for aviation fuel of France's Charles de Gaulle, and nearly 400% more space for storing munitions. This results partly from the size of the ship, but also from the smaller volume required by nuclear propulsion systems than fossil fuel-based systems. Large decks thus can sustain a given tempo of operations for a longer time, and also have more space for the addition of new technology during their service lives. Small carriers generate much less electricity. Modern warships require vast supplies of electricity to function effectively. For instance, the range and sensitivity of defensive radars is closely tied to the availability of a sizable electricity source. The twin nuclear reactors on the Ford class will each be able to generate 300 megawatts of power, 3 times the output of Nimitz reactors. A carrier equipped with turbine engines powered by fossil fuel could only produce a small fraction of this amount, limiting its warfighting performance. Small carriers can't accomplish multiple missions simultaneously. The air wings hosted on large deck carriers are designed to perform reconnaissance, sea control and power projection, strike operations, simultaneously. That isn't feasible on a smaller carrier because there aren't enough planes, there aren't enough sorties, and there is too little space to operate specialized airframes such as radar planes. Thus, 2 smaller carriers might be required to execute an air operation that one large deck could accomplish. Small carriers can't substitute for land bases. Large deck carriers are, in effect, floating bases. That can make a big difference in places where the US military lacks access to bases ashore, or bases are likely to be destroyed by enemies early in a conflict. Because large-deck, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers can remain forward deployed indefinitely and can maneuver continuously to avoid being targeted, they provide operational flexibility that would not be available from small carriers with less aircraft, stores and endurance. Small carriers don't really save money. Proponents of small carriers seem to assume that savings from buying small carriers rather than big carriers would be proportional to the difference in their sizes. However, the savings are not linear. A large deck carrier will cost incrementally more to build than a small carrier, but be able to conduct twice as many sorties per day for longer periods of time. Whatever the premium for nuclear propulsion may be, it is recovered over the vessel's service life in lower sustainment costs and higher productivity. Small carriers have hidden costs. In a related vein, the price tag for a small, conventionally powered aircraft carrier may omit some items crucial to its operability. For instance, if it needs to be frequently refueled at sea, then the Navy will have to maintain a bigger fleet of replenishment ships to carry the necessary fuel. And if it is less capable of policing nearby airspace or defending itself against surface and undersea threats, then it may require additional escort vessels. A single escort vessel can cost over $1 billion. Small carriers would drain money from higher priority programs. The Navy lacks sufficient funding to meet its modernization goals, and that situation may not change. Whether a new class of small carriers was added to or substituted for the current complement of large deck carriers. It would take at least 20 years to generate budget benefits due to development times and the need to keep current warships operating. During most of that time, it would be draining money from more important programs, such as the replacement of aging submarines. When the various disabilities of the small carrier concept are scrutinized in light of operational and fiscal realities, it becomes clear there is no analytic foundation for such an initiative. Large-deck, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are a signature feature of U.S. military power, delivering unique warfighting advantages to the joint force. Rather than diverting money to less capable carriers, it would make more sense to accelerate the construction of the Ford class with an aim of operating more large-deck carriers and reducing stress on the fleet.